Okay, after the Hagim, we returned from the Sukkah. We're back indoors, the cold weather, and we are on our fourth class, chapter 2 of A Question of Redemption, about Israel in the past and today and tomorrow. So we begin on chapter 2. Let me just review the very end of chapter 1. Chapter 1 answered the question, can the redemption come about through people who fail to keep God's commandments? And in the end, the conclusion was, indeed, it could, and it was God's decision as to how it would happen. We'll just look at what the Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, wrote about this in the, this would be in the late 1800s. He publicized the following paragraphs from the book called Shivat Zion, a compilation of letters from great Torah authorities in favor of the modern-day return to Zion. We must not speculate that this great matter, the resettlement of Eretz Yisrael, should have occurred differently. His point is that it's not for us to decide how God brings about his plan for the world. We may have a different plan, but in the end, we should go along with God. Indeed, one must not express this opinion to God, as the prophet Yeshaya says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. We must not be overly wise and say that it has to happen a different way. Ezra the scribe gathered a few thousand Jews in Babylon, all types of people, great Torah scholars, God-fearing individuals, and also men who had foreign wives, people who regularly violated the Sabbath, and those who had no Torah knowledge whatsoever. These people worked together and prepared the land for settlement until it was eventually filled with its children. We too must awaken to the sound of God's desire, which resonates from one end of the earth to the other, wherever our brethren are scattered, all types of Jews. This is what the Netziv wrote prior to 1900. I think one of the points that he's making, and one of the points that we should never forget, is that whether we are living in Israel or not, that Israel is central to the Jewish mind, to the Jewish heart, to the Jewish soul. There are many reasons why people may not end up in Israel, but it never should be viewed as an ordinary thought when we think about Israel. You know, for generations, our parents and great-grandparents, going way back to the time of Babylon, kept in their minds and in their mouths the desire to return to Israel. 2,000 years later, we're able to do it. We should be very thankful. And we should be aware of how important it has always been and how central it has been.
Can I just interrupt here?
Yep.
My understanding, it wasn't actually central. It was traditional, it was ritualistic, but not actual desire and something which is possible.
Let me put it this way to you, is that it was not viewed as possible because of the circumstances that existed. You know, there were captive people, there were second-class citizens, often impossible to travel. What travel there was very difficult and rudimentary. Where they were going was very difficult. So I'm not saying it was viewed as possible, but it never left their minds and thoughts. You know, the rebuilding of Jerusalem is discussed 3 times a day in our prayers. You know, it's a consciousness that's always with us. Not to mention, our holidays revolve around it. So many things revolve around it. The fact that it was impossible meant that we had to develop psychological comforts to manage an impossible thing which was a central desire. But I don't think you could ever say it wasn't a desire. And interestingly enough, when it came to the point, finally, generations later, when people did say, well, you know, Worms is our new Jerusalem. Berlin is our new Jerusalem. Paris is our new Jerusalem. New York, Lakewood is our new Jerusalem. People generally found this not a pleasant thought. you can't replace it so easily. You make statements about it because we can't get to Jerusalem. Right? But never let it leave your heart that that's where the final desire is. You know. But the possibilities of it happen were so difficult that we really felt it was, you know, it would take major revealed miracles for it to happen. And I would say, indeed, it did. Chapter 2. Can redemption come when our leaders fail to observe mitzvahs? And second question, is there any value to building the land without Torah and Mitzvot? So these are very important questions. Who can lead the way to redemption? In the last chapter we saw that the redemption can occur even when the nation is on a low spiritual level. However, in all the examples we brought, the reins of authority were in the hands of righteous leaders. Even though the people faltered in their Torah observance, great prophets and Torah personalities like Moshe, Aaron, Ezra, and Nehemiah guided them on the straight path and led the way to redemption. The question is, can wicked leaders that are not only not religious but actually wicked leaders, the question is, can wicked leaders bring about redemption? Can anything positive emerge from leadership that fights against halacha, against the laws of Torah? Omri, Achav, and other kings of Israel will answer these questions for us. You know, one of the complaints about the leadership of the founding leadership of Israel, and even today, is that they are either not religious or not religious enough, that it's a Jewish state but not a Torah state. And one of the questions one has to ask is, what is the direction it's heading in? And what are the tools that God uses to accomplish his ends? And rather than determine what those tools are, perhaps we should observe what those tools are in the process. The scriptures state that Omri was worse than all the wicked kings that preceded him, including Yerovam ben Nevat. Nevertheless, he was privileged to establish the dynasty that lasted for 4 generations.
Was he from David? Is Davidic dynasty?
We'll answer that question shortly. Rabbi Yochanan said, why did Omri deserve kingship? Because he added a city to the land of Israel, is the answer. That is to say, even wicked kings could increase the borders, could secure the country. The Medrash adds that Omri's entire purpose in building the city... What?
Can't we increase borders? We have our borders.
Yes, but our borders are often foreshortened, and we have to fight to get them back. Remember, even the current state of Israel.
Yeah,
right?
but here he added a city into the land of Israel.
That's right. But he also, we'll see, he also broadened the borders as well. But this was within Israel, that within Shomron. The Medrash tells us that Omri's entire purpose in building this city, Shomron, was to undermine Israel's loyalty to Jerusalem as the undisputed capital of Israel. Even though his motives were impure, 3 of his descendants inherited the throne in reward for the city he built. Omri's mitzvah of building the land was of great value despite the fact that people continued to sin in his city. In fact, he was trying to offer a city that would be a substitute for Jerusalem in the north. They even declared their rebellion against God publicly. As Rabbi Yochanan said, Achav inscribed on the gates of Shomron, Achav repudiates the God of Israel, therefore he has no share in the God of Israel. This is King, very famous, Ahab and Jezebel. This is Achav. Achav was the son of Omri. Achav, Omri's son, was even more wicked than his father. He married a Gentile woman, built houses of idolatry, and allowed his wife Jezebel, to murder all the prophets of the Lord. It's terrible. This is a very upsetting story. The Mishnah counts him as one of the 4 kings who have no portion in the world to come. That's in Sanhedrin 998. According to the Medrash, he wanted Israel to forget God's name, so he took a Torah scroll, erased all the mentions of God's name, and substitute them with the names of idols. Not only did he practice to encourage idolatry, he fought and murdered observant Jews and prophets of Hashem. So one would gauge from this description that he is not one of our favorite people in history, I think. In fact, that he was a very evil person. And consequently, he should, he has no place in the world to come, let alone a place in this world. But, despite his extreme wickedness, a prophet once approached him and promised that God would help him win his imminent battle. When Achav asked, who would lead the troops? The prophet answered, you. The Radak explains that Achav asked this question because he did not believe God would perform miracles for him. He considered it impossible for salvation to arise by way of a leader as wicked as himself. Much to his surprise, however, the prophet told him that he, Achav, would lead the troops and that God would help him to prevail. It goes on. He had a son. Achav's son, Yehoram. The next line, Yehoram, son of Achav, also angered God. You see this again in Malachim 2. In retribution for his sins and the sins of his generations, God plagued Eretz Yisrael with 7 years of famine. At the end of this period, Elisha, the prophet, announced that a special miracle was about to take place. The next morning, there would be abundance and food throughout the city. This is a very famous story. We read it in the Haftorah. It's a story about the lepers who leave the city. They can't get into the city, and they're very hungry. And the city is being besieged by, I believe it's the Assyrians. And the lepers say, well, let's see what's in the Assyrian camp. Maybe they'll give us some food or something. And they go, and to their surprise, the Assyrian camp, which had besieged Jerusalem, is gone, disappeared. Almost reminiscent that, when I heard the story of the Iraqi retreat from Kuwait, this highway that was covered with military vehicles and army clothes of the Iraqis who were fleeing in front of the forces that had taken back Kuwait and moving them back. This is what it was like in the Assyrian camp. It was emptied. There were still fires, coals of fires that were hot. There was food cooking, and there was nothing there.
Nobody there.
There was nobody there. No persons there. Back in Jerusalem, people had been starving to death under the siege. Right? And ministers of the king had said, when Elisha said, and tomorrow the price of wheat will drop dramatically. And the minister said, over my dead body, basically, which is something you should never do when a prophet makes a prediction. Let's read the story. One of the king's officers refused to believe that such a miracle as a dramatic drop in prices could happen, and he punished, because what was happening is, as the siege was going on, there was less and less food, and food became more and more expensive. Right. One of the king's officers refused to believe that such a miracle could happen, and he was punished for his lack of faith. The masses trampled him to death before he could enjoy the food. The Medrash explains that the officer knew that God could do anything he wants. He simply did not believe that Hashem would perform miracles for such a sinful generation. The officer said to them, is God going to perform miracles for this wicked generation, whose deeds are similar to the deeds of the generation of the flood? By the way, we're coming up to Parsha Noah. The Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, You incriminate my children? What happened to him? The people trampled him at the gate and killed him. Thus an entire family, grandfather, son, and grandson, merited miraculous salvation despite their wickedness, despite the fact that the nation was steeped in sin, and despite the fact that the leaders fought against Torah Judaism. In the case of Omri, we saw that the merit of building a city in Eretz Yisrael stood him in good stead. But what about the other two kings? Virtuous impersonal conduct protected Achav and his generation from harm. As the Medrash says, Achav's entire generation worshipped idols, but since there were no slanderers among them, they would go out to war and win.
No Lashon Hara, I mean?
That's right. It's a very curious thing. Achav, who was a genuinely evil person, murderer of prophet after prophet after prophet. You know, there's a story in the Haftorah of a very poor woman, and she has no money to feed her family, and the prophet comes to her and says, "Yeah, close the door, right? Mm-hmm. But before you do, collect all the empty vessels you can." Right? Mm-hmm. She had all the empty vessels. He said, "Begin to pour oil from this vessel into the empty vessels." And eventually she filled up all the vessels in her house. Every vessel was filled, right? And there were no more vessels, and then the oil stopped at that point. And she had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Mm-hmm. Who was this woman? This woman was the wife of the prophet Obadiah. Obadiah had saved hundreds of prophets in caves and fed them and wherever. But eventually, Ahab hunted them down, Jezebel hunted them down and killed them. And he was left, at the end, killed. And his wife and sons were stricken with terrible poverty. And this is another story in the Haftorah about a miracle that saved them at this time. Mm-hmm. But in Ahab's generation, Ahab was victorious over and over in war, and the explanation that we're given for it is that because it was a generation where there may have been murder. Horrible. There was no Lashon Hara. So you ask the question, that doesn't make sense. Lashon Hara
actually it makes sense.
It does.
I actually can.
Why does it make sense to you?
Because everybody understands that everybody is sinner. They all idol worshippers. They all do wrong thing. Nobody sits on a high horse and look down on anybody. There is no cause for Lashon Hara. Nobody says I'm righteous.
So people, because they were sinners, weren't
They're
arrogant?
all sinners. They were not arrogant. They're all exactly in the same level of whatever. And they don't have to, nobody can look at himself and say, I am righteous, and he is not doing mitzvah. I'm not doing mitzvah. He's not doing mitzvah. We're all okay.
You know, it's an interesting position you take. There is a statement that God is more uncomfortable in the house of an arrogant man than in a house of ill repute. Because in a house of ill repute,
everybody knows.
You know, there's humility and there's prayer. In the house of an arrogant man, he says, I did it all. Mm-hmm. And actually, his ego is so big, there's no room for God in such an environment. So it's a good argument you have. On the other hand, you know, the generation of the flood were people who were very arrogant and sinners at the same time. You know, their arrogance allowed them to say, "That's mine, not yours." Right? Why? Because I can take it. Right? My power, my strength. You know, the generation of the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel, seems to have been the leadership very arrogant and go to war with God. So I'm not sure that sinning, you know, necessarily guarantees humility, but it's an interesting argument that you make. I would argue that maybe one of the reasons is that Lashon Hara, scandalous evil speech, is something that is often pervasive. People usually don't even feel like it's a sin unless it's pointed out to them. You know, people listen to, you know, Lashon Hara is useless unless you have a listener, right? So if the listener refuses to hear it, it kind of defeats the purpose of it. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, Lashon Hara is a scandal, is something that is of great interest and entertaining to people. So it's pervasive in a nation. Murder is an individual crime. It can be the crime of a king, it can be the crime of an evil person, but it tends to be an individual crime for which maybe a nation should not be punished. In the case of Lashon Hara, if you can avoid it, it's something, the point here is that there was merit given to the whole nation because it was avoided during that time. It doesn't explain why there was no Lashon Hara. I should
Just the fact that it wasn't. Huh?
It's hard to believe.
It's hard to believe.
They will not talk.
No, you could.
No font?
It's an idea that people, to avoid Lashon Hara, that people don't speak. But in fact, the person who wrote the book on Lashon Hara, the Chafetz Chaim, was not a person of few words. He talked constantly, but he limited his conversation to things that were not about, personal behavior of an individual. They were more, about Torah, about examples, about himself even. But he was very careful about how he spoke of other individuals. He was very, very careful about it. But it wasn't that, he went around, I will avoid Lashon Hara by not speaking. Mm-hmm. There are organizations that, in the merit of avoiding Lashon Hara, hope for a better world, for good reason. And so what they do is they organize a 24-hour period in which everybody takes 1 hour, and they make a promise to themselves, I'm not going to speak any Lashon Hara. Now, my guess is the most popular hours are probably 3 and 4 a.m. in the morning, when, people are not having a problem with Lashon Hara. Noon is much tougher. But that's about Lashon Hara. I don't know how they avoided Lashon Hara, and it doesn't say in the generation of Achav. Mm-hmm. So it says, since there were no slanderers among them, they would go out to war and win. Furthermore, Achav valued Jewish nationalism, using his last ounce of strength to help Israel defeat its enemies. Yehoram shared in the suffering. Yehoram shared in the suffering of his people, wearing sackcloth underneath his garments when famine struck. Although he was prepared to kill Elisha the prophet, the merit of safeguarding the Jewish people stood by him. He didn't do it. Mm-hmm. In the Second Commonwealth, now we're getting to, our return to Israel is really noted in 3 epic moments. One is when we return as a nation with Joshua out of the Midbar, out of the wilderness. The second time is the return to and the rebuilding of the temple that happens through a number of stages. It begins under Koresh, under Cyrus the Great, who had defeated Babylon and became the king of Persia. And Cyrus the Great sent back the captive peoples, especially the Jews, to rebuild. Zerubbabel was the leader of that generation. And they began to work on building the Mizbeach. They didn't get very far, and all construction was halted. We know that this happened during the time of Achashverosh. It was the Hebrew name. And then they continued when Ezra and then later Nehemiah returned to rebuild the city and to rebuild the walls, in a second flow out of Persia back to Jerusalem, to Eretz Israel. And we're going to learn more about this as it goes further. And of course, the third time is in our lifetimes itself. The initial impetus for Ezra and Nehemiah's redemption actually came from a Gentile king. Cyrus, king of Persia, ruled over Eretz Yisrael at the time, and he gave the Jews permission to return to the land and rebuild the temple. The Medrash indicates that God's choice of messenger astounded the people in that generation as well. The assembly, and this is a quote from Shir Shirim Rabbah, the assembly of Israel, Knesset Yisrael, said to the Holy One, blessed be He, Master of the universe, would it not have been better to perform all these miracles through Daniel or another righteous individual instead of Koresh? They're asking a very important question. Koresh? A Gentile? He's responsible for our redemption? In fact, the Talmud refers to him as a Savior, as a Redeemer of Israel, as a Mashiach. It's the only reference to a non-Jew as Mashiach, right? And I've told the story before, but I can't help repeating it at this moment, is that sometime after he had his term as president had ended, Harry Truman was asked the question, why was it that you supported a vote in the UN for the creation of the State of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people? Your entire State Department was against it, the Defense Department was against it, your cabinet was against it, politics pointed in a different direction, Arab size, Arab oil, all those things. Why did you do it? And he had a very simple answer. He said, I'm Cyrus. I'm Cyrus. Which is an interesting thing because Harry Truman was an individual who knew by heart the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, but also Tanakh. He wanted to be remembered. And he wanted it understood that his motivation was one of doing the right thing, to be the Gentile who returned the Jews to their homeland in Israel. Right? And so that's how he described himself. I'm Cyrus, Koresh.
And Hiroshima and Nagasaki is his fault too, yeah?
He made a very difficult decision during the Second World War. His calculation.
I wonder what he's remembered more for.
His calculation was that by being the first person to use a nuclear weapon in war, that he would save more lives, both American and Japanese, than to invade the islands of Japan and march through trying to conquer the country. And his argument was, if I shock them enough that they immediately surrender, that will be overall a positive thing. It worked. They did surrender. But I think the question in history remains a question in history. There are those people who abhor what he did. There are others who say that not only did this save lives, but it may have prevented a major third nuclear war. When we saw what the destruction was of this thing, that the Russians and Americans, who could have destroyed each other over and over and over again, chose not to. Maybe this was an awareness they had as well. Anyway, it's not for me to justify Truman in his decision, but I think the point that you're making is he remembered as the guy who dropped the nuclear bomb or the guy who returned the Jews to Israel? I would say he's not remembered by most people as Cyrus, although I would guess that he wanted to be. Okay, where are we here? Yerovam II. Undoubtedly, though, Yerovam, the son of Joash, received more help from God than any other evil king. After enumerating his many sins, the prophet describes almost in the same breath the great salvation that he brought to the Jewish people. So this is now the fourth generation. In the 15th year of Amatzyahu, the son of Joash, king of Yehuda, Yerovam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Shomron. And he reigned for 41 years. It's a very long reign. He did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not part with all the sins. He did not part with all the sins of Yerovam, the son of Nevat, who caused Israel to sin. That is to say, he didn't separate himself from his father's sins, he continued them. But he restored the border of Israel from the Levant to Hamat until the sea of the Arava, like the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spoke by the hand of his servant Yonah, the son of Amittai. This is the only other mention of the prophet Yonah, other than the book of Yonah, by the way. The prophet who came from Gat Hefer. For the Lord saw that Israel's affliction was very bitter, and there was none surviving and none remaining, and there was no helper for Israel. But the Lord did not speak to erase the name of Israel from under the heavens. And so he saved them by the hand of Yerovam, the son of Joash. What he's saying here is, had God not done this, that it could be that Israel would have been destroyed completely at this time. It was under a great deal of pressure. And so that sometimes, God uses the tools that exist in the world to do what is required in his process. And so that this evil king was what there was. And God said, okay, I'm going to work with this evil king. He's not my first choice, right?
This is, I don't understand. This, the phrase like this, I can't understand.
You know, I'm very nervous about saying this, but I will say it. We're on the edge of an American election right now. And people are just choosing between candidates that are not a choice between platinum and gold, right? We should not think, right, that the solutions to the world's problems are dependent on, you know, a Winston Churchill, you know, who we thought of as, you know, a heroic character at a certain time, right? Sometimes God chooses people that are not of our first choice, not what we would call
But it's
savory
his
characters.
first choice.
It's God. No, God. God first
We
of all
don't know
allows.
reasoning, but this is his choice.
First of all, a principle of the process of the universe is freedom of choice, right? So God allows a process, particularly in a democracy, to make choices, good and bad choices, right? It doesn't mean that at the end of the day, God does not have a plan for history, and what the tools he has, he'll work with, right? You know, that's a principle, and we see it over and over historically.
Not because he doesn't have any other tools. He chooses these tools.
No, that's not true.
Hashem doesn't have a free will?
Hashem is loath to violate the free will of his people. Right? That is to say, he allows the free will of his people to make mistakes. It happens all the time. We see it biblically, we see it rabbinically, and we see it historically. You know, we are not, you know, a perfect people by any means. And if God ruled the world by true judgment instead of mercy, none of us would be here. The point is, God can choose anybody he wants. Right? And what we understand is that God doesn't work that way. God doesn't make divine appointments. I will choose this person because he is the best. Right? He tells the people to choose, especially in our current system where we have an electoral system. Right? You choose, right? But know, at the end of the day, things that are important to me, one way or the other, will be what I want them to be. Right? And so historically, you know, the list of Jewish kings, first of all, the list of kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, is disastrous. You know, all kinds of development of idol worshippers and alternatives to Jerusalem and building idols, and it's a very upsetting history. But even the southern kingdom, Yehuda, has many kings that we wouldn't consider to be our first choice. And we know historically these things have happened over and over and over. God uses what is available to make the process work for himself. He doesn't say, you know, the story of Korach is an exception. You're evil people and you're choosing to dispute with Moshe, you know, my prophet, right? And you've gone too far, and now I'm going to do something that I never do historically, and never did again. You know, the miraculous solution to problems is not God's first choice, it's his absolutely last choice, right? He would much prefer to work within a historical environment, and it becomes our job, right, to observe what this is and to see it for what it is, rather than to say, gee, God isn't doing it the right way. This is the whole point of one of the elements of this book, is instead of our saying it's not the way God should be doing it, we should observe this is how God does it, right, and learn from the process. Continue? Yeroboam's numerous sins, we're talking about Yeroboam II, did not prevent God from using him as his agent to bring a wondrous salvation to the Jewish people. God even sent Yerovam a prophet, Yonah ben Amittai, to inform this sinner that he would succeed in conquering more territory than almost any other king in Jewish history. Rav Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, Shlita, writes some very sharp and conclusive words on the issue in his response to Tzitz Eliezer. It's a classic work written right around the time of the Shoah. It seems clear to me that there is no reason whatsoever to refuse to come to the land just because the heads of state have, for the most part, cast off the yoke of Torah due to our numerous sins. There is also no basis for the argument that the heavenly redemption cannot possibly arise through people who have no fear of God in their hearts. Such claims are inherently flawed, and their refutation is obvious, for it is clear that the greater the religious aliyah, the more influence Orthodox Jewry will have on the state's institutions. Then, in the course of time, our efforts to improve matters will be crowned with success, with God's help. Besides this, who can fully comprehend divine providence and fathom the Almighty? Such events have occurred before, namely when there was none surviving and none remaining. Hashem sent his hallowed assistance through an evil king of Israel to widen the borders of the land and to settle multitudes of Jews there. Most astounding is the fact that the scriptures mention this conquest in praise of that king immediately after mentioning how wicked he was. We can only explain this anomaly in the sense of a sin cannot extinguish a mitzvah. There are verses, here are the verses I'm referring to. In the 15th year of Amayatsu, son of Joash, king of Yehuda, Yerovam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Shamron, etc. We read this already. So, thus the prophets of truth and righteousness describe clearly, like a dream of its interpretation, the wondrous sight of Israel being saved from an enemy by way of an exceedingly wicked man in all respects. Now, it is well known that nothing included in the Holy Scriptures, even in story form, is written merely for the sake of storytelling, God forbid. Remember, this is not Mishnah, right? This is Haftorah, this is Navi. Rather, it serves as prophecy and instruction for future generations. Accordingly say, fortunate is the man who heeds your commandments and places your Torah and your word on his heart. And not only your Torah, but your word. What is your word you told to the prophets, right? So your Torah is Torah B'Ksav, and your word is the word of the prophets, Tanakh. It follows then that the verses cited above are included in the prophets for the same reason, to serve as a guiding light and to give us clear insight into every event that occurs throughout the generations. Therefore, who could assure us and confirm with a handshake that we are not considered very bitter and none remaining and no helper? After the great destruction perpetrated at by that enemy of mankind, Hitler, Yimach Shemo, our situation during the Holocaust was certainly no less dire than in the days of Yerovam. It seems to me that there has never been such a ruthless, widespread genocide since the creation of humanity. However, Hashem showed us his loving kindness and did not speak to erase, quote, to erase the name of Israel from under the heavens, although it certainly was the goal of our enemy. Therefore, it is not far-fetched to say that when we desperately needed an independent state on solid ground like our land, Hashem assisted us in his great mercy through those who held the reins of national leadership all along and were willing and able to do the job. And he did not pay attention to the fact that most of them failed to observe Torah and Mitzvah. Why do you involve yourself with the Merciful One's hidden matters? Primarily, we must fulfill our obligations toward God and keep his mitzvahs, including the great and lofty mitzvah of ascending and settling the land of Israel, which is equal to all the mitzvahs of Torah, says the Tzitz Eliezer. As it says in the Sifri, in Parsha Re'eh, and in the Tosefta in Avodah Zarah. We must also try to motivate, to the best of our abilities, anyone who bears the name of Israel, in the government and outside it, in cities and villages to return to God and His Torah for our own benefit. Fools who sin will eventually suffer the consequences, and Hashem will do whatever is good in His eyes. So we'll hold here with the words of the Tzitzi Eliezer. But I think that, he's pointing to, we've all been learning outside of this the works of who?
Begin, Jabotinsky,
And Rav Kook, right? And one of the things that strikes you about Rav Kook is that he holds very closely, philosophically, to the view of the Tzitzi Eliezer. It's not for me to decide how God will operate. I want this to be a Torah land. It has to have Jewish sovereignty to be a Torah land. For sure, without Jewish sovereignty, it cannot be a Torah land. Because we have Jewish sovereignty doesn't necessarily make it a perfect Torah land. Right? But there's great promise to it, and it's our job to continue to move in that direction. I think that was the point of Rav Kook. I think that's the point of the Tzitzi Eliezer here. Right?
Did he made Aliyah?
Yeah. I don't think he did. No, I don't think he did. But I'm not sure of that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. So I think that there is a, and the other thing which is true of our history from beginning to end, not just about Israel, but about virtually everything, is that we don't have a history of attaining the level that is demanded of us by God. That's not our history. Our history is that we move forward, we backslide, we move forward. We never quite get to the point that we should be at. And our strength is that we persist. As a people, as individuals, as a nation, we persist in this effort. We don't really give it up. Some do. But as a nation, we continue. And as a reborn nation, there's great hope for the future.
Amen.